Well, welcome everybody. My name is Margarita Mooney, and I am the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation. I thank you all for being here today, and I especially thank our guest, Dana Gioia. Before I introduce Dana and begin our conversation on the intersection of art and philosophy, how we come to comprehend the beautiful, I wanted to tell you a little bit about why this conversation is so important to the mission of Scala Foundation. I started Scala in 2016 because I really believe in the value of a classical liberal arts education grounded in the idea that humans are created in the image of God. And through its many summer programs, faculty seminars, and conferences, Scala seeks to bring together students, educators, concerned citizens, teachers at any level who care about the pursuit of truth and the integration of truth with beauty. Now, these questions often sound very philosophical, but I am more and more convinced every day that the only kind of a good education that is a practical education must be philosophically grounded in the correct understanding of the human person. Now, as a teacher, I love the kinds of dialogues I have in the seminar room with students, or when I take them on hikes or to Benedictine monasteries. During these times of COVID, many of us are not in our regular teaching environments. We're at home. So starting in March, I began to have a series of online conversations that I called the Love of Learning. And I invited some of my favorite scholars and authors and friends, people like Dana Gioia, to join me online and extend the conversations that I've been so lucky to have, to extend those conversations to you, including my students who are enrolled in my classes this fall at Princeton Theological Seminary. I'm teaching on aesthetics and Christian education. I'm also teaching a class on philosophy of social science. I'm pleased to welcome today as well educators from other universities, including our co-sponsor, the St. Thomas Catholic Studies program. There are high school teachers here with us today, foundation officers, friends, people who care about this mission of liberal arts education and educating the whole person. So thank you all for being here today. I wanted to say there will be time for you to submit questions at the end. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. In the chat box, please continue to introduce yourself. It's wonderful to see we have people here from Scotland. We have people here from a variety of universities, including our co-sponsor, University of St. Thomas. We have people here from Cambridge in the UK, local people here in New Jersey, Philadelphia, local to me, as well as people local to Dana in California. Okay, now let me introduce our distinguished guest. Dana Gioia is a poet. He studied as an undergraduate at Stanford University and had a career in business, but also pursued his practice, his love of writing, eventually getting an MA in comparative literature from Harvard and becoming an award-winning poet and the director of the National Endowment of the Arts. As part of his work in the National Endowment of the Arts and as Poet Laureate of California, he has thought profoundly about the topic we're going to discuss today: the dialogue between art and philosophy, how we come to comprehend the beautiful, and why this perhaps seemingly esoteric topic of a Scala webinar is actually a timely and practical question for our schools, for communities of faith, and for families and people in the United States and anywhere who care about beauty, truth-seeking, and the good life. Dana, thank you so much for being here with us today. And I wanted to just pick up, like we were talking on the phone recently. In fact, for our viewers to know, I have not met Dana in person. We connected through our common interest in integrating beauty and truth-seeking, and we've had wonderful phone conversations that have shaped my teaching, for which I am extremely grateful for the time you've given me to think about these topics and bring them into the classroom. And I'm grateful for your time today to bring these ideas to an even bigger audience. But if I could pick up when we last spoke about this topic of art and philosophy, you made a really important point that beauty is always embodied. So why don't we start this philosophical conversation talking about artists? Could you tell us who are some of the artists and poets who you've thought about, who you've been inspired by? What were some of their major poems or works of art, turning points in their careers? And what does that tell us about their philosophy of beauty?
Well, let me start off by saying I was an extremely weird child. When other people were, following, baseball, I was reading about art. And so, I had a very good traditional education, 12 years of Catholic school, Stanford, followed by Harvard. I had a fairly deep education in philosophy, theology, but that part of my education always seemed like it was on one side. I liked it. It was a self-contained world that I was very interested in. But then I had another side that was self-contained too, which was experiential. And that is where art itself educated me. As a little kid, I saw a special on Michelangelo on TV. And I went to the library and I began reading about Michelangelo. Then I began reading about all of these Italian artists. And so I began to develop completely I've never taken an art history class, a very deep understanding of visual arts that was in some ways empirical. I followed what I liked. Now for poetry, the poet who's most influenced me, the person closest to me, besides Shakespeare, Shakespeare is in a sort of class by himself, is an English poet named W.H. Auden, A-U-D-E-N, Wystan Hugh Auden. I hope people know him. And his very smart but very sensuous poetry, I think in some ways was one of the ways I began to take this philosophical side of my existence, theological side of my existence, and the experiential side and bring them together. Now, the modern world has been in some ways disfigured by theories of art, theories of beauty, dare I say, philosophies of beauty. All of you have been downtown and you've seen these brutalist modern buildings. They'll rise up 50 stories and it will be absolutely identical, unadorned, symmetrical squares or rectangles. The average person sees those and recognizes them as ugly, as inhuman, as unnatural. But this has been the dominant theory. This was the Bauhaus, which is, get rid of all ornament. But experientially, we know that if we walk through a forest, trees are never identical. Nature is never absolutely identical. There's something about this which is a simplification, a disfigurement of our natural function. And so being educated in beauty, reading poetry, seeing paintings, understanding architecture, allows you to take what's on the experiential side and the intellectual side and integrate them. It's taken me 40 years to bring those sides together where I actually know what I believe and why.
So that's wonderful, Dana, because you started off saying that as a young, curious, I think you even said weird or strange kid, you thought that your desire to understand things in the world, material, technical things, you thought that was somehow different than this longing you had for beauty or for expression in art, and that it's taken you 40 years to develop a coherent philosophical framework that is perhaps simply an elaborate explanation for what you were already doing. And
let me say this, when I was 20, I knew the answers for everything. Give me politics, give me aesthetics, give me literature. I knew the answer. I was living in a kind of, and I think a lot of graduate students are this, we live in a kind of video game that we keep rising, the levels, there, but that video game doesn't connect to the outer world. And it was only when I took these theories that I tried to apply them in practice, but that means you have to, in a sense, create intuitive, experiential knowledge, and then the theoretical and the empirical form a dialectic, and they refine their understanding. anybody
Mhm.
who wants to get towards truth has to, in some degree, be a Hegelian. You know, you have to believe, or a Platonist. You have to believe in dialectic. That's why it's important to talk. I mean, you and I are smarter together than we are separately. And the 59 people that are participating right now, together we have a collective intelligence. If we listen to each other and we argue with each other, than we have separately. This is what's scary about the intellectual world that we're in, which suppresses so many conversations, which tries to limit the topics of conversation. You know, the delete culture does not get towards truth.
Mhm. Well, and I think we could perhaps move, think a little bit about some of the figures that you spoke about, W.H. Auden. You also spoke about Dostoevsky when we spoke, and we've also spoken many times about Jacques Maritain or Dietrich von
Margarita,
Hildebrand, and they
yeah,
all cared about fighting totalitarianism in some
yes,
ways.
yeah, and also, you know, most importantly, very difficult to get around is Maritain's source, which is Aquinas. Uh, you know, and let me go to you know, Aquinas. You talk about formative people. You know, took all of these classes, philosophy classes, Western civ classes at Stanford. I took a lot of highly theoretical philosophical courses at Harvard. Uh, and these things that I read at 19 only began to make sense when I was 50 or I was 43 or whatever. But, you know, what I learned from Aquinas, and this was essential, which is the interrelationship between beauty and truth. From Aquinas, I learned something that most contemporary aesthetic philosophers have forgotten, which is beauty is a form of knowing. Beauty is a way of discerning truths uh, holistically. And this is what a poet has to understand. I can come up with an idea for a poem. I just did a writer, a magazine in Chile just interviewed me because I have a book of my poems coming out of Madrid in Spanish translation. Um, I told them that, you know, I can come up with an idea for a poem, but the idea won't make a poem. Uh, you know, the poem has to begin in an embodied first line. I have to have a line like, when do the sessions of sweet silent thought, like Shakespeare, where you suddenly the music, the sentiment, the emotion, the intuition is all there together inseparably.
Mhm.
And that's what we are. We know that we are incarnate beings. You know, we have a mind, we have an imagination, we have a soul, we have a physical body with five senses, but it also has intuition, it also has memory. As we go through our daily life, maybe if for the really bright graduate students listening, if you're on a really good day, for 45 minutes of the day, you'll be capable of rational intellectual thought. You know, the other, 23 hours and 15 minutes, you're going to experience it the way everybody else on this planet does, holistically as an integrated human being. So
Yes.
the power of art, and this is why aesthetics is fundamental to theology and to philosophy. Most of what we know holistically. And it's to take that, and that's why art exists. Art exists to give us a way of knowing, which our whole human capability can participate in, which gives us wisdom through pleasure, or gives us wisdom through going,
Mm.
that's awful. You know, why do I think that's so awful? You know, you begin to think through that. So
Right.
anyway, I talk too much.
No,
You
this
already
is
know that.
wonderful. Oh, no, you could talk to me as much as you want. In fact, I think our conversations have already produced half a book here because I take notes after we talk and think about it. But what you're expressing here is that works of art are embodied they're objects in the world, but at the same time, they have an important symbolic dimension. They express a a conception of humanity and a conception of being human in the world. And it's through reading, perhaps difficult sometimes to read, people like Aquinas or how he was interpreted and perhaps even extended through Jacques Maritain. It's by encountering philosophy and objects and going back and forth, right? You talked about how, and I've experienced this so much in the intellectual world, we live in a world of ideas and we live in a world of abstractions. And then the concrete material world has been reduced to simply sensory perception or simply empirical material reality.
Or worse yet, it has been designed by ideas in the absence of complete, human reaction. So they create something that everybody recognizes as ugly, but they believe is beautiful because their theory of beauty, says it is so, despite the empirical reaction of people. I mean, I think 12-tone music is this. For 80, 90 years, almost a century, the best minds of the Western musical world have been trying to tell people that 12-tone music is die Musik der Zukunft, the music of the future. But a century later, nobody likes it. There's something about it that is unnatural, that is not designed. Well, by unnatural, I don't mean, bad, sinful or whatever. I mean, it's not designed for the natural human sensory reaction. You could only approach it intellectually. Now, a work of art is kind of weird, and people have to understand this. I'll give you a story. In ancient Greece, I can't remember what sculpture it was. I think it was Praxiteles. He made a statue of a woman that was so beautiful that they had a civic problem. Young men would come at night and they would just kiss the statue, or they would caress the statue because it was just so sexy. And now, I would say that is a perfectly reasonable reaction to the work of art, but it's partial, because that work of art, if a work of art is great, it exists in the physical universe as an independent object. I can look at a beautiful tree and I can say, oh my God, that's an expression of nature. Or I can say, good, that's going to be a lot of lumber if I cut it down. Or I can look at it, the object allows all sorts of interpretations. And so, we look at a play by Shakespeare, we can read it as, this way or that way. And that's the beauty of it. It becomes an independent object. And so part of the object, the meaning these things have is the symbolic, quality of it. But the problem is when the object doesn't really have any independent existence. And I would say that a lot of brutalist modernist architecture is in the physical universe. There's no way that you can ignore, 200, tons of concrete, but you can only approach it through the theory. It has no beauty outside of its satisfaction of certain abstract qualities.
Right.
So my point is that art is created through part of humanity, which is the intuitive, holistic imagination. And you bring it into the physical universe as something that embodies beauty. And suddenly it becomes independent of you, and it allows many interpretations. So Dostoevsky can be read by the Marxists as talking about the urban alienation, which creates the dialectic that only communism can solve. He can be read by Christians as somebody describing a Christian existentialist, dilemma. He can be read by social historians. He can be read by psychoanalysts. And Dostoevsky is so great that the independent energy of his novels are so magnificent that they allow, quite rightly, all of these different interpretations. That is why totalitarians hate art unless they can control it, because you can come to it and come to a completely opposite interpretation than the one that the dictator allows. So you always see censorship in totalitarian regimes.
That's fascinating. I mean, you've said several fascinating things right there. And I would recommend that for people to understand even more deeply what you've said about Aquinas on art, that they look at your video presentation that you did through First Things, where you
Yeah.
talk about beauty and talk more deeply
And
about
it's
this.
also on YouTube now, which is easier for, it's on
Oh,
both
great.
Zoom, it's on both, we just put it up on YouTube. It's already been
Great.
attacked by people.
Great. Well, what you say there and what you've said here today is that part of what we perceive as beautiful in the world corresponds to our human nature. So certain buildings are beautiful, not because we deem them to be beautiful in the abstract world of the laboratory, but because human beings are certain kinds of creatures that perceive certain objects as beautiful and others as repulsive. But you
Yeah, and that
also
and that
said,
that's fundamental. And I want to just refine your idea one bit, because
mhm,
postmodernism says I think something is beautiful because the power structure of my society deems that it is beautiful. And I do not believe this. I believe that things that are beautiful participate uh, in the beauty of nature, the beauty of creation, that we're operating within these natural rules, which our bodies, minds, memories, imagination, intuition correspond. Now, that doesn't mean that if I talk about Michelangelo's greatness all the time, that people don't bring a certain attention to Michelangelo. But people have brought a certain attention, to, let's say, the music of Milton Babbitt, to speak of a great name of Princeton. And they give him prizes and they say it's great, but people still don't like him because there's something that's entirely abstract and analytical about his music that we don't respond to. So
right.
the social dimension may amplify your experience, but it will not take something that is ugly and make it beautiful, or something ugly is perhaps the wrong word. Well, ugly is maybe is the right word, but something that is abstract,
Right.
arid, unnatural, and ugly, and make it beauty just because society says it's so. In fact, society all the time tries to tell us that certain things are, because they're so uplifting, they're so moral in the way what society approves, but people shy away from those things. So,
Mhm. Well, thanks to you, Dana, speaking of Princeton influences, I read a book written by Jacques Maritain, the philosopher, while he was living in Princeton, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. And I now assign his pieces from that in my classes on education and on aesthetics, because he elaborates on this point that you just made, that certain trends in art actually are trying to exhibit a view of human consciousness which tries to get rid of what he calls the spiritual preconscious and talk about, so postmodernism or surrealism sees our consciousness as stopping at the level of the Freudian subconscious, passions, instincts, and drives, but with no ordering principle rooted in the powers of the intellect, rooted in our reason. And so what Maritain does is try to say, well, yeah, sure, we have a subconscious for sure, but we've forgotten that there's this part of the human person, which in Christian philosophy and tradition and theology is talked of as the heart or the soul, but it's a place of deep contemplation of the eternal, of God, but that works itself out and becomes the ordering principle for the co-creation of objects in the world through art and
yeah, well,
beauty.
Maritain, whom I came to in my 40s, uh, was to me one of the pivotal people I read in my life. And it was because Maritain was a European who was just one of those Europeans who had culture to the very tips of his fingertips. He knew the poets, he knew the painters, he knew the composers. He moved in these rich intellectual and cultural circles, and he, in a sense, began to solve the modernist dilemma with kind of Thomistic insights. Now, I want to start with the thing that has helped me so much from Maritain. It's very simple. He said that there are at least 4 kinds of knowledge. The first he calls scientific. and that's where everything can be expressed in numbers and ratios and relationships. And we know that from mathematics, from trigonometry, from physics, from chemistry. And it gives you tremendous power and allows you to see into the world. There's another type of knowledge, which is, and this is where you live at Princeton, which is conceptual knowledge. That's where everything becomes an abstraction, and you use all these symbolic abstractions. So a man is talking to a woman, we're talking on a computer, we have students that are, or fellow writers or fellow thinkers that are watching us. Every word I've used is an abstraction, which is different than Dana, Margarita. Let's see who was in the last chat thing. I think Susie has brought into the chat thing. And Susie, but Susie is very different than a student. And so, but we need those abstractions to make order of our universe. So you can't write laws without the abstractions. You can't teach philosophy. And so, it is a powerful and valid way of knowing the world. Now, Maritain does something which only a Catholic would do. He says there's a next kind of knowledge is mystical knowledge, where somebody will just come and will be enlightened. I mean, the most famous example of that in Christianity is Saul of Tarsus, who has this mystical encounter with the risen Jesus, and then becomes St. Paul. And he then lectures on all the knowledge that he got in that mystical moment. And Maritain is smart enough to say this is very rare. It's not going to happen to you or me. But then he says, and this is the whole thing, this is a fourth kind of knowledge, and this is very important, which is independent yet equal to scientific knowledge, conceptual knowledge. We'll put mystical knowledge outside of the trio right now. And this is what he calls preconceptual intuitive knowledge. He lacks name, so he calls it poetic knowledge. These are these insights that you have, that you feel, you could understand, you have the emotions, but you have not reduced them to abstract concepts. And so the knowledge always comes out as embodied, having a physical, emotional, intuitive, imaginative level. Now, the trouble with modern art is that, especially contemporary art, is it's tried to substitute conceptual knowledge for poetic knowledge, for that intuitive knowledge. And if I would urge people, if they have never read Maritain, read the 20 or 30 pages in which Maritain talks about the ways of these valid, independent, and co-equal ways of knowing the world. It will simplify everything that happens to you, that, from that point on. It'll give you a framework, which I find is perpetually useful.
I couldn't agree more. Now, I will say I've been teaching these chapters in my classes, and so you can actually find on my blog, I put what I found to be the most important quotes and ideas from Maritain's book, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, hopefully as an entree to help people read the full text and try to understand the implication of what he's saying. Because again, these ideas may be new to some of you, but I think these ideas are profoundly important to our educational institutions, our churches, our life in common.
Yeah. Well, as a Catholic, as a Catholic, an American Catholic, I can't speak for for Catholics abroad, but the Catholic Church lost its historical connection with beauty probably about 100 years ago. And there's sociological reasons for this. I would like to blame the Irish, but it is because the Catholic clergy was faced with these huge waves of poor immigrants. They had to build churches, they had to build schools, and they just sort of knocked them out in this kind of functional way. Think of Bauhaus, form follows function. If you need 20 rooms, just make 20 identical rooms. Don't put any decoration, and you've achieved an architectural masterpiece. But the problem with functional architecture, the problem with functional churches, is they do not serve their actual function, which is, in a sense, enlarging our imaginative and emotional, spiritual perceptions so that we can encounter the divine. The power of art, the power of beauty, is that it speaks to me in the completeness of my humanity. It speaks simultaneously to my intellect, my emotions, my imagination, my intuition, my physical body, and my personal memory without asking me to separate any of those things. Because it's still at the level where it has not become a concept that's abstracted from, the embodiment or from my personality. And that power is so important because that is the way, as I said before, that 23 hours and 15 minutes of the day, even philosophers experience their own existence.
Right. I mean, one way to think about it in sort of modern terms is that you're describing sort of the being mode, the mode in our existence when all of our capacities are working together. The heart, the reason, the emotions, the intuition, our subjectivity, our objectivity, we're fully present to all of reality in its complexity. And what art does, art, poetry, beauty, architecture, is that it evokes in us this desire for an integration of those capacities. But if art and beauty doesn't have the characteristics or the forms, then it can actually deaden our sensibility or deaden our desire, our need for coherence in our identity and in our capacity.
Well, this is where, this is what I tried to talk about in the video I've done on beauty, which is the experience of beauty. So we're going along for, our 23 hours and 15 minutes of just holistic behavior. We're just trotting along, doing this, that, and the other. And then suddenly, and it probably happens every day, something just stops you in your tracks. Something strikes you as beautiful. And it makes you pause. It gives you a sense of pleasure. It gives you an elevation. And you suddenly have an insight. And this is, I love, Maritain phrasing of this, is that you feel the secrets of existence radiating onto the intelligence. It goes back to Thomas Aquinas. Those of you who've read Aquinas, or you've just read James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, this notion of integritas consonantia claritas, the beauty of the whole, the harmony of the parts, and the radiance that it gives. It, as you start to look at the thing, you see its beautiful whole, you start to notice how the parts of it combine. Suddenly it begins to radiate the pleasures of beauty, the secrets of existence, radiating onto your intelligence. And when Maritain uses the word intelligence, he doesn't mean abstract intelligence only. He means your senses, your physical body, your imagination, your intuition. And so yes. I guess that's what I would urge people is to try to find a way of integrating these ways of knowing. You don't have to read everything in the Western and Eastern canon to be wise. But you do need to study a few great things, to ponder them, and allow them, in a sense, to go into a dialogue with what your daily experience is. And that's why I think that conversations are the most natural way of doing this.
Well, I would just say, to build on, just to give an example of what you were talking about, that when beauty seems to open you to the truth about existence. One of the platitudes about beauty is that beauty is a synonym for attractiveness. Roger Scruton, in his work on beauty, I really like his short book on beauty. There's a wonderful video of him talking about beauty that I highly recommend to people. But he says that's just a platitude. And you've said very clearly in your previous talks that beauty really is something that arrests our attention. It's not a synonym for attractiveness. So one thing I do when I teach on this topic is I just ask students to write down briefly, when was the last time they had a really powerful experience of beauty? What was the object that they were looking at? Was it a sunset? Was it something in nature? Was it a beautiful piece of architecture? What was it? And what was going on in their life? And why did that object spark a sense of beauty. And one thing I shared with my students, and I know you've written on this topic as well, so I hope it's okay to bring it up, is actually the link between beauty and suffering, which breaks down the platitude that beauty is purely about attractiveness. When I was close to someone who was dying, I had these moments of walking into a church to pray, feeling completely distraught and being hit over the head by the enormity and the beauty of the space and of the liturgy. And those moments were like a beam of light into my soul that reminded me that there's a wholeness to existence that not even death can take away. And so we're creatures in the image of God, but we are mortal beings who decay. But there's a beauty that can hold even those seeming paradoxes of love and death and saying goodbye, and hold all of those human experiences that we all have, hold them together and give them a sense of really even blessedness in the midst of suffering.
Let me tell you a story about beauty. On August 17th of this year, I was wakened in the middle of the night by a thunderstorm. In fact, pretty much everyone in Northern California was woken up by this thunderstorm. There was this magnificent storm that went on for 5 or 6 hours, where the whole sky was electrified with lightning. By the morning, there had been 12,000 lightning strikes, and all of Northern California was on fire. That day I saw, the smoke coming up, and that night I saw this mountain next to me that was on fire. It was beautiful. It was sublime in its beauty, even though I said, oh my God, there's a good chance that my house is going to burn down. And I was shocking, because what I was seeing was how nature, through electrical storms, clears its own landscapes. About a week later, everybody in California, Northern California, even fairly far south, saw something that was a transfiguring beauty. First of all, almost everyone in the state overslept because the sun did not come out. In fact, the newscasters who were broadcasting in their own living rooms overslept. But when people got up, they saw, and I'm sure people have seen this on the media, they saw a violent orange sky that was over the whole state. And people just simply went outside, began taking pictures, just began staring at it. It was beautiful. It was a terrifying, awful, apocalyptic beauty. But what we saw was the sky when the world is on fire. It's a sight that I hope most of us never see again. But it was transfiguring. It wasn't pretty. The smoke in your nostrils and your lungs was burning, but it was, no matter where you were, you had to go out and look at it. It was transfiguring, and it gave you this vision that pushed away every pretty notion you had about Mother Nature. And Mother Nature had been drinking all night, and she was now breaking up the furniture. And so we understood that our relationship with her is much more complicated than we saw. So this goes into Scruton's point. Beauty has almost nothing to do with being pretty. Beauty is about this arresting of your attention, this tremendous feeling of the exhilaration of your senses, and this insight into the secrets of existence. And so as 4 million acres have burned in California, I have witnessed again and again apocalyptic beauty.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is also responding to a different platitude, that beauty is about something that should be pleasing to us. And it sounds more like you're saying, with regards to my example of beauty in the midst of suffering, the loss of a loved one, and your experience of beauty in the midst of wildfires, to say that, well, that experience of beauty is part of a recognition of the existence of what we are, that human beings are mortal, and that nature itself grows and develops, but it also can decay. So it's
Yeah.
revealing to us of what human nature truly is.
See, if you get back to Aquinas, Aquinas is so smart. I guess that's it doesn't need to be said, but it should be repeated. Is that it talks about the integritas, the beauty of the wholeness of the form, but where beauty begins is not just with that; it's where you take the beauty of the thing and then you see what he calls consonantia, which is the way that the parts speak to itself. You can say it's the harmonia mundi, the harmony of the world. And what we see in a forest fire are the interconnections that we have not normally allowed ourselves to witness. And so what beauty is not the pretty, that's pretty. Here's a pretty, it's a pretty shape, people like to buy it, but it doesn't give me the consonantia and it doesn't give me the claritas, it doesn't give me the radiance, of insight. And that's what I think, what's the most beautiful play ever written? I would nominate King Lear. In King Lear, a father turns on the daughter, daughters turn on the father, brother turns on brother, son turns on parent, master turns on servant, king betrays the people. The entire order of the world falls apart, and there is unspeakable suffering in this play. But what the play allows us to see by opening up, destroying all the human relations which make society, politics, family possible, by betraying every one of those, Shakespeare allows us, in a sense, to see into the nature of the human heart, of love, of friendship, of parental love. And as the world comes back together, which happens at the very end, with bodies lying everywhere, we have been taken on a journey of insight that we could not have received without that suffering. That's why when we're with somebody and we say this is a good death or this is a bad death, and I've had both of those in my family, the good death clarifies absolutely everything in the life up to that moment. Art doesn't simply bring us ahead, it allows us, in a sense, to have retrospective knowledge about things. So anyway, so I think that's beauty. But anyway, I talk about this in the other talks. So I won't belabor it.
I'll just ask a couple of related questions and we're going to move into the Q&A. We have some questions coming in from the audience and I would encourage people to put further questions in the Q&A button. But let me just say, building on your last point, another philosopher who I love to teach in my classes is Alasdair MacIntyre. And in his well-known book, After Virtue, he talks about the narrative structure of human existence. And one of the fundamental needs we have as human beings is to connect our past with the present, with the future, and also with a shared story, a tradition, a set of practices that embody that tradition. So when you're talking about great works of literature, a great play like King Lear, part of what great literature does is that it helps us ponder our own identity in relationship to past, present, and future. And part of what great artworks do when they pierce through into our soul is give us a sense of that whole to which we belong. And this is why I think art, literature, and beauty needs to be a central part of education, because so many young students are struggling in an educational system that's focused on skills and credentials, which of course I value as well. But there are things about being human that don't have a material value or don't have a sort of pragmatic action in the world. And also in a lot of circles in the academy, students are often taught a kind of quasi-nihilist understanding about the world, that there is no inherent meaning, that, hey, well then if that's true, then why isn't suffering or evil the ultimate truth? And there is no such thing as beauty, and there is no such thing as good. And I've seen students struggle under the weight of nihilistic philosophies coming to them intentionally or perhaps simply through the kinds of messages they're being given in their classes.
Well,
so
see, I think the university today suffers from what I would call low-cost, prefabricated nihilism. If you're going to be a nihilist, it should be a philosophy that you come to with much effort, and probably, out of a certain psychohistory. But I want to go back to something more, the first thing you said, because I think it's essential. You and I and everybody who's watching right now perceives their own existence as a story. You live a story in which you are the heroine, you are the protagonist. And so the story is the natural way that we perceive human existence. Our minds are designed this way. If you take 10 data points and you give people 10 data points in a list, or you put a story where those happen sequentially, people remember nearly twice as many of the data points as a story as they do as an abstract list. So we are storytelling, story living creatures. Now, if you don't believe me, you cannot be a Christian without accepting this, because when Jesus spoke to the multitudes, he spoke by telling stories, occasionally by giving poetic short poems and proverbs, but storytelling, the parables, were the way that he embodied the truth so that people could understand them. And once again, you create a story, it has an independent existence. When I was a little kid, I took the parable of the prodigal son and I knew what it was about. It was about a bad kid. I had a lot of experience being a bad kid. So it was about a bad kid and his father. As I became a father, I realized that no, it's a story about a guy trying to be a good father with a difficult son. But then as I got a little older, I realized no, it was about my own family with my siblings. So it's actually a story about two brothers. And the fact is that it's about all of those things. The story has an independent existence, like a statue. You can see it from the front, the back, the side, the distance, or close up. And that's the power of the narrative. Jesus understood that if you were going to get truths to people, you had to give it to a form that they could understand and they could remember and they could ponder, and they could take those interpretations which they needed at any moment from those parables. That's the power of the great novelists.
Look, we're going to move into the audience questions, but I just want to make a sort of biographical point here that, you and I share something in common. We both have backgrounds that are part Hispanic. Your mother is Mexican, my mother is Cuban. So everything you just said resonates so much with me, because I grew up, by the way, my mother is listening today. Hi, Mom. I grew up with a mother who told stories in speech, in English and Spanish, but she also sang, right? So we sang a lot in our home, and you've written about this and spoken about this, how your mother and your grandmother would speak to you in poetry that they had memorized. So sometimes people think, oh, all of this discussion about art and beauty and literature is somehow elitist.
Let me make one more point, though, about that, because it's really essential. Is that you're living a story, your mother's living a story, I'm living a story, but we have to constantly revise that story because the circumstances of our life change. You leave it in a story, it's going along well, and then you hit a brick wall. So one of the reasons we need to study literature is that everybody who lives has to create and recreate and revise and update their own stories all the time. So you need to train your imagination so that when you hit a problem, you can revise your story around that. Mm-hmm. I have known a number of people who killed themselves. In fact, a dear friend of mine killed himself last December. Mm-hmm. And it's because their story hits an impasse and they cannot bear it. They cannot bear their existence, and they don't know how to revise themselves out of it. They don't know how to imagine freeing themselves from that impasse. That is why everyone from an early age needs to be immersed in literature to create an imagination fruitful, capacious, innovative enough to lead their own lives productively.
Well, thank you for sharing that. As a segue into the audience questions, I will also share that Interestingly enough, part of the reason I became interested in beauty was not because of my degrees, which are in psychology and sociology, which never spoke of beauty other than perhaps to say that beauty is a socially constructed category that gives certain groups of people power over others. At most, that's what we would say. But when I did interviews with young adults who had suffered some kind of trauma, I was struck at how many of them had been borderline suicidal or nihilistic, but had an overwhelming experience of beauty that transformed them. Now, that beauty might have come in the form of a religious intuition, a kind of conversion to Christianity, but for others, it was nature or some artistic form. So I actually became interested in beauty and its relationship to God, but also in its relationship to drawing out human potentialities, human capacities that have been deadened or weakened by abuse, sexual abuse that I heard about, drug abuse, terrible life circumstances. But in some real way, beauty was saving people because it was teaching them their full humanity. And now I, as a Catholic, like you, raised going to parochial schools that I'm grateful for, that embodied liturgy, art, poem in the liturgy and in the classroom, which I learned science and math, and I thought that was beautiful too. But I grew up in this environment that was really different, that had this kind of holistic conception. And I began to wonder, well, I, as a person of faith, think that the origin of this beauty is what I would call God, who became man in Jesus Christ. But the experience of beauty and the desire for the infinite or the divine is a human capacity that everybody has, even people raised in extremely different environments than me. And what are we doing when we talk about people who've suffered terrible trauma and we only treat them at the psychological level, which, hey, I'm not against that, or we only treat them at the biological or physical level? What about their soul? What about their longing for beauty and for wholeness? So I think that these questions, sorry, you want to respond to that,
No,
Dana?
no, I absolutely agree with you. Part of the power of beauty is that it speaks to people in the completeness of their humanity, and it awakens memories, it awakens imagination, it sharpens intuition. It brings the physical body. Some people are very disconnected from their own physical bodies. Academics are terribly disconnected from their bodies. And so you have these things, and so it gives you a heightened sense of your own possibilities as a human being, so many of which have been deadened. But
Right.
the fact is that
In some ways, beauty is eminently practical, right? If we care about all the anxiety and suffering we see today, beauty is a practical way of helping people, of reaching people in their full humanity.
But it's also, if we were created, and even if you don't believe in God, we were designed by evolution to exist in a natural world, which as Christians we feel proclaims the glory of God. And so we have to us always the capacity of, in a sense, of participating in the true part of our nature by being in creation, by being in nature. And
That's right.
in people that are sort of living in, on the computer, living in the rooms, are deadening their senses through drugs. In some ways, they need to be opened up to the possibilities within themselves, and the way that the outer world speaks to us.
Exactly, which is why, it sounds paradoxical, but you've been saying again and again that beauty is not some sort of abstraction, right? That beauty puts us concretely in our bodies and in the material world, at the same time that it helps us to transcend the immediate circumstances. And this is what Dietrich von Hildebrand, another person whose philosophy of aesthetics I teach in my classes, this is what he would say, right? That beauty helps us transcend ourselves while becoming more ourselves, because we're more fully ourselves when we're in tune with this creative intuition in our soul that allows us to connect to the material world, to connect to other people, and to be open, ultimately, as a Christian, I believe, to the receptivity of God in all of creation.
I was trained really well in Catholic theology, but Catholicism to me was more of a burden or a complication, or it was never a painful burden, but it was something until I embodied it in the daily existence of my life. Uh, I am a Catholic because I know from my own experience that it works. It gives meaning to every moment of my life. It allows me to love people in a productive, versus a damaging way. It provides perspective on things. And so, what I'm urging people who are participating, some of whom may know more than you or I do about this subject, which is that we're leading the story of our lives. You wouldn't be here participating today if the spiritual dimension of that life was not fundamental to you.
Mm.
So, what I'm urging to do is to open, it's almost like the aperture of a camera. Open the aperture of your soul, of your imagination, of your intuition, in a sense, to the way that beauty will awaken in you these possibilities that you hunger to realize. I mean, the
Mhm.
Oscar Wilde quote, "Man hungers for beauty. There is a void." So many of my students have this void in their life, and they're trying to fill it with nihilism, they're trying to fill it with cynicism, they're trying to fill it with entertainment, but it doesn't make them happy. Or it doesn't, in a sense, give them a sense of purpose. Happiness is a slippery word, but a sense that every moment of your life matters, and that even the pain has purpose. Uh, Even the pain is, in a sense, a step towards joy.
Wonderful, Dana. Since you and I are talking about our students, let me bridge to a question coming in from the audience from a professor named Daryl DiMarzio at the University of Scranton. He teaches philosophy and education. He also teaches at Columbia Teachers College. And he wants to know more about the practical applications of this to education. So, for example, would you say that schools, or generally speaking, places of learning, need to have architecture and spaces that open up students to receive the divine and participate in a reflection on their transcendence? So is beauty really integral to this love of learning, and should it be embodied physically in the way we actually construct classrooms and
Yeah,
spaces of learning?
if possible. I mean, this is the problem: is that we've inherited ugly buildings. My high school architecture could be described as early California Gestapo. And it's just these sickly green cinder blocks, and it did not add to the education. I mean, so much of the way art operates is beyond words, is outside of conceptual knowledge. So if you can create a situation where people are encountering the beautiful, could be in the gardens and the landscaping rather than the architecture, could be the interior decoration that a teacher gives to a classroom. Those things, I think, will
Right.
amplify the openness that people have. And so,
Absolutely.
but I also think art should be part of education. I mean, when you try to teach reading through functional tests, these functional texts don't excite people. They have no emotional involvement with them.
Right. Well, I would also say, to answer in part Daryl's question, I have visited a number of classical academies in the United States, but also abroad. And there are some characteristics of these classical academies that I think enshrine what Daryl was getting at. They have windows. So when you're in the classroom, you're in built space, but you also have a vision of the outdoors. Students spend some time out in nature. Even if it's cold, you can put your coat and your gloves on and go outdoors and be together in nature. And the walls have painting and have pictures. Again, in Roger Scruton's book on beauty, he says that beauty doesn't have to be, having a Chagall painting or a Tiffany lamp. Beauty can be in the everyday objects. It can be in how you set up the classroom so that there's an openness, that there's color, that there's light. And look, what do we do in prison architecture? What do we do in communist architecture? We have, as you said, and sometimes even in some schools or churches, cinder blocks with tiny little slits for windows. Well, how is that good for our creative intuition, for our imagination?
It's a very simple principle, I would say. Architecture is never neutral. That's the problem with functional architecture. Functionality is never neutral. The architecture of a place tells people how to behave inside it. When you create alienating architecture in the downtown of cities, you should not be surprised that crime happens, because you have alienated the people from the very place that they live and work. And so I think the architecture of a school, the decoration of a school is fundamental, but sometimes you're just trapped because what you've inherited is so ugly. So what you're only doing are small fixes. You're putting Band-Aids on lethal wounds.
And I would just also add, bringing in another question from the audience from one of the students in my class this semester, Tamara Bush. She asks whether what you're saying kind of points to this point that there are cultural standard, the point you made earlier, that there are standards of beauty that are universal, and that may explain why there are certain objects of art or architecture that don't stand the test of time because they don't actually live up to these universal standards of beauty. Well, last summer, 2019, I went on a trip with the engineering department of Princeton University to Italy, and we studied 2,000 years of structures in Italy, looking at innovation, form, function, and beauty. I actually wrote an article about this trip that came out in Scientific American, where I talked about how engineers also have this longing for beauty, and the engine of scientific innovation isn't technology, it's the creative human person longing for beauty. But to answer Tamara's question and then put it back to you, well, if you look at 2,000 years of architecture in Italy, not everything stood the test of time as being beautiful. Things get knocked down. But architecture and art that stands the test of time and is seen by universally across time and cultures as beautiful, it's because it corresponds to what you said about the human person being created to perceive certain types of forms, right?
Well, the big lie of contemporary arts. I mean, Hitler thought about, when you lie big. The big lie of contemporary art is that there is no universals of beauty. Scientifically, that has now been disproven. Certain proportions and things like that happen. Now, a way of thinking about beauty is that there are universals of beauty that different cultures, because they're living in different landscapes, different climates, in different situations, articulate by national traditions. But the fact is that people from somebody from England can come and see the Taj Mahal and go, man, that's gorgeous. Last year I saw a exhibition, which I thought was going to be really not good, but I had to go because, a friend was doing it, an exhibition about the rooftops of Ethiopian churches. I mean, that's not a crowd pleaser. I mean, that's not like, seeing the latest Star Wars film. But I went to it and they were magnificent because they were all designed. And the only person that sees them is God. But they did these things. And as somebody who's never been to Ethiopia, I was just struck by the beauty of these things because they took a sort of a cultural articulation of universal principles. So, people respond more or less to certain things that are hardwired in our imagination. And to deny that and to say it's all culturally determined is simply an empirical stupidity.
Well, the last set of questions that I want to turn our attention to coming in from the audience are things that you've alluded to in your talk, but people would like to go a little deeper into the question of the relationship between beauty, truth, and God. And so one question comes in about sort of how do we understand sort of this idea about God being a supreme beauty and God also being embodied? And what is the, for example, the Christian understanding of the incarnation say about this idea of God as the eternal beauty, but also God as an incarnate, embodied human? How can we think about these things?
Well, God is pure spirit, but God also created all that is. And so and I think there's, an interesting way of traditional, they'll say that God speaks to us in three different ways. He speaks to us in revelation, in scripture. And, we have this. God spoke to us directly in the incarnation, where God chooses to become man and suffers for our sins. Now, but the third way is that God speaks to us in the beauty and the glory of creation. This is an idea that is said hundreds of times in scripture. They don't use the word beauty because beauty is almost too small of a word. They'll talk about the beauty of the lilies or something, but for God, it is glory. It is beauty on a magnificent level. At nights through the smoke, I can still see Mars burning red in the night sky. I can see the moon come up over the hills. And God, what God is giving us is a vision of divine order, where the order is beautiful because it's an expression of God's truth. And so I think you have to think of those things as interconnected. Once again, to go back to your story about suffering and pain can be beautiful, Jesus's life is beautiful, but it is a life that ends in the passion, the crucifixion, and the death, redeemed by the resurrection. But those things, what he's telling us is all of those dark things are part of the total existence. They're part of the price of the glory of the resurrection. So God is mysterious and beyond our knowing, but he has given us, with everything he has created, in a sense, an insight that we as humans can make in terms of his existence.
That's great. I mean, I'll just bridge then into perhaps the last question we're going to have time for today. But what you said is really beautiful. And if I could try to use some philosophical or theological language, I think when we say that God's beauty is mysterious, we're referring to God's transcendence, to this idea that this kind of metaphysical understanding of God as beautiful, but yet through the incarnation, God has become a part of the world. And so part of the Christian faith is that through the incarnation, we can understand all of created reality as being imbibed with a sense of the divine, which doesn't mean that there's not a transcendent, supreme beauty in God, but that we see God both in a transcendent kind of beauty, but also in an immanent beauty in the world. And that our creation as human beings, we are created in a particular way to perceive certain things as beautiful. And ultimately, through our approaching the beautiful, to come into the glory of the beauty, the fullness of the beauty of God, that always yet remains a mystery.
Well, I think the fundamental reality of the Catholic artist, and I think the practicing Catholic, is that we lead metaphysical existences. We simultaneously exist in a way in a physical world, but we always feel the immanence of the divine. And every now and then we get a little peek in it. That's what beauty does, in a sense, is to give us a peek of that. But it's that, and that's one of the reasons that Catholicism, my faith, gives me joy. My existence is full and overfull. I, in a sense, can participate in the glory of the world, and I can feel the grace of the eternal beyond it. And that's why the artists speak so powerfully to us. If that's the last question, I want to say something.
I will just point people to understand even more deeply what you've just said. I was meditating on your beautiful essay, The Catholic Writer Today. I think that's the name of it. But
yeah.
Where you talk about what does it mean to be a Catholic artist, to be a Catholic poet. And you look at why there aren't a whole lot of Catholic poets, which was actually the last question that I didn't get to say because I went off on my own thought, was about Christianity and poetry. So what would you make, for example, one listener named Kathleen Marsh would like to know what you might make of the Catholic poet Denise Levertov's Notes on Organic Form as a model of poetry that mediates what you've been talking about, the experiential and the theoretical modes of perception,
Well, yeah,
expression and
yeah.
experience.
Levertov was a poet who came to Catholicism relatively late in life. I think her notes on organic form predate her conversion to Catholicism, and her poetics, I think, give one way of getting to poetry. But there are many ways of getting to poetry, because what poetry is simply our most precise, memorable, and moving way of using words to explain the nature of our own existence. In which we, in a sense, we have embodied language, which is holistic language. And there's different ways, but Levertov is a very important poet, and actually a person I know is writing a biographer of right now, a woman named Dana Green. So
Great.
another DG. But I wanted to end by just saying I did not get a chance to meet any of you personally, but we have to understand that we have been asked by God, we've been asked by Jesus, in a sense, to be a family, to love one another as brothers, as sisters, as children, as parents. And those of us who are serious about, in a sense, the artistic, the intellectual heritage of Catholicism, we are a neighborhood in the invisible city of God. We are in the communion of saints. And so I hope that I'll have a chance in the future to meet each one of you. Come up, don't be afraid of introducing yourself. Don't be shy about one another, because it is through that communion of saints, through that city of God, that we will transform ourselves, our church, and if we do a true and good enough job, the world. So God bless each and every one of you. Lead the story of your lives with an intense sense of your own destiny. And I know that our destinies will intertwine.
Well, Dana, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to have you here today. And again, I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Catholic Studies at St. Thomas. I want to thank all the generous benefactors of Scala Foundation that make this webinar possible. And I completely share with you this beautiful vision that even in these difficult times when we're separated geographically from each other, that we can still unite and find each other through our shared passion for these ideas. And in fact, please, those of you listening, if you don't already, follow Scala on social media, YouTube, to continue engaging around these ideas. We'll be having further events, further discussions. And I also hope to meet each of you in person when possible, to have an event. I dream of having an event called Educating the Beautiful Mind, where we bring together poets, philosophers, policymakers, educators, and parents to continue and to extend these discussions. And it's the passion that drives me to teach, to reach out and just to have conversations with. I just want to thank God for giving me the chance to meet Dana virtually, and through the friendship that we sparked, share these ideas with a greater public. And I think that's what you're talking about, Dana. If you give of yourself, as you have given to me, I can amplify this by bringing other people. And same to you, every one of you listening can take these ideas, ponder them, and share them with somebody else. So I'll just add on to Dana's beautiful point, a challenge. What are you going to do today to share with somebody else what you've learned? Because I know I have been blessed to have met Dana, and now you have too. And I send all of you away with this mission to share what you've learned and to keep learning and to keep that desire and that love of learning and that passion going. Thank you, Dana. Thank you to all of our attendees, and hope to see you all soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.